All right, so now we're going to transition into our first panel discussion of the day to be moderated by Ms. Kimba Walden. If we could ask the panelists to move up towards the stage. The first two goals that were called out in the task force report were focused on deterrence and disruption. I think a lot of everybody in this room deal with elements of this on the day-to-day. I'm very much personally looking forward to this conversation because I think there has been a lot of activity on this front. I'm going to turn things over to Kimba here. I think the intent, as was called out in the report, was to do as much as is physically possible to create space for those who are actually trying to build greater resilience, right? So as everyone begins to try to better defend themselves, what can we do to actually disrupt the activities that are coming at us every day? So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Kimba, over to you.
Great, thank you, Phil. Can everybody hear me? Good, excellent. Wonderful. Well, welcome to our panel. Am I doing this properly? Is it on? Can you hear me now if you couldn't before? Okay, good. I think we're going here. Well, great. Well, first, thank you to Lisa Monaco for those instructive comments. We are grateful for your time and thank you for answering our questions. As you know, and as we reported a year ago, a little more than a year ago, ransomware is you've heard me say this before, right? A low-cost, high-profit business. It's our mission as a part of the security community to shift that balance, to make it more costly to enter the business of ransomware, but then to also reduce the profitability. The Ransomware Task Force report, the deterrence and disruption recommendations, were developed with this shift in balance in mind. And so I wanted to sort of take stock about, deterrence and disruption, our recommendations, what has happened over the past year, and really discuss those with three of our experts here. First, I was going to start with a question, but first, let's introduce each one of you in case you aren't familiar. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself? And then David, and then Eleanor?
So I'm Chris Painter. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Ransomware Task Force report on the deterrence part. In particular, longtime U.S. government, first federal prosecutor, computer crime and intellectual property section at the mothership at Justice, then at the White House, and then for many years as our top and first cyber diplomat at the State Department. And now, among other things, I am the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation, which is a global cyber capacity building group. Happy to be here.
Good morning. I'm Dave Scott. I'm currently the Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI Cyber Division. In that role, I serve over the Cyber Operations Branch and then also in a dual role as the Director of the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force.
Good morning, I'm Eleanor Fairford. I'm over from London from the NCSE in the UK, which Andrew mentioned earlier in his comments, so the National Technical Authority in the UK on cyber. I am the Deputy Director responsible for incident management, so for the sort of cyber emergency response of NCSE for organisations seeking support. And prior to that, I headed up our strategic intelligence assessment section, looking at the broader threat landscape and informing the intelligence community in the UK.
Thank you. And again, I'm Kimba Walden. I'm a co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force, and I am an Assistant General Counsel in Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit. So let's get right to it. One of the most important recommendations in my mind that we proffered was that we need to declare that ransomware is a national security concern, which our president did do. And I think, Phil, you mentioned a few forums where that was declared. I'm curious from our panelists, do you think that had an impact? Was that important? I would love your thoughts. Chris, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been doing some aspect of cyber crime, cybersecurity, not doing cyber crime, but combating it, for like over 30 years. And the thing we'd always argued for was for these issues to really reach the top of the national agenda, to be seen as a true national security, economic security, and really a national issue. I mean, and sadly, although nation state activity got some attention, a lot of the criminal activity, as important as all the things that Lisa talked about, Lisa Monaco talked about, that have been done at Justice for years, it was never at the very top of the agenda, I think. And so, number one thing, as we looked at this issue, is look, this is being treated as a back burner issue while it's causing immense amounts of damage in the US and around the world. And we really need to treat it as a much more higher priority. And we saw that. I mean, now I'd like to say it was just because of a report, but it's certainly because of Colonial Pipelines in particular and the Irish healthcare system and JB Foods making it a real visceral issue for people. Because normally when you talk about these issues, they're like, well, it's not in fact impacting me, but now it's impacting ordinary citizens, and that helped transform it in a very short time to when President Biden raised it at the G7 and an already crowded G7 agenda. It was one of the top issues at NATO with Putin, all the activity that's happened internationally, which Eleanor and others can talk about, and all the activity that happened the FBI. And being a longtime justice person, I also realized that you needed messages from the top, from the Attorney General, from the Director of the FBI saying, you have lots of things to do, but this is a real no kidding priority. And that happened too. So, when I first worked with Lisa was in 2001 at Justice, and she worked for then Attorney General Janet Reno, and cyber was an issue. We were dealing with some of the big denial of service attack cases and other things. But it's amazing to see how much we've come just really in the past 2 years in terms of how much of a priority this is. And that drives everything else. If it's not seen as a priority, it slides to the back of the agenda and you don't get the activity. Now, the one downside I'd say is this can't be a priority for like a month or 6 months or even a year. You need a sustained effort. We are not good in the US, and I don't know how the UK is, that we're not good at doing sustained efforts on things. And so we can't lose the bubble on this. It's really important to continue it. But I really think that undergirds everything else in our recommendations. If it wasn't seen as a national security priority, we just wouldn't make the progress we have.
Yeah, so just to follow up on what Chris said, I think that it's clearly a national security priority for us. Our cyber division in the FBI is the youngest division of all of them, and it's the smallest division. But we've really come to a point where it's hard to distinguish between the ransomware actors and the APTs and decide which one's which. So as it comes in, we've got to decide at a moment's notice where this is going to be worked and how we're going to react to each one of these incidents. And it's clearly become such a critical issue. And to get out there to those victims and make sure, like with Colonial and others, that we're able to have that interaction quickly and decide whether this is going to pose a national security risk or if it's just going to be a criminal act against a victim. We have to take those actions immediately. So I think that I come from a counterterrorism background where everything was clearly a life or death situation. And I think cyber is getting to that point. When you have ransomware attacks against hospitals or 911 dispatch centers, it actually affects lives. And so we have to take everything and treat it as a national security risk.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's been a really instrumental part of raising it up the agenda, hasn't it, over the past year, being able to describe it in these terms. And I think for me, it's always been quite an easy case to make, hasn't it? I mean, time and again, we've seen ransomware take out critical infrastructure, government systems. In the UK, we saw the sort of pseudo ransomware WannaCry nearly cripple the entire NHS. It doesn't take much of a leap of imagination to really take ministers and seniors to a really dark place. Things like that could have resulted in mass deaths. We could have seen that take place. We've seen ransomware attacks against local authorities in the UK, which have done things like prevent house purchases and transactions from taking place, and they've impacted on daily lives of citizens. But imagine if one took place during a general election and impeded access to election voting booths, right? Or, it doesn't take much of a leap of imagination to really see how something as like simple as ransomware could easily be massively disruptive in a national security sort of level. And just a really quick story, we had a crisis a few months ago where we realized that we only had one company that produced carbon dioxide in the whole of the UK. And it turned out that carbon dioxide is really important for like food packaging and a whole bunch of really important supply chain type issues. And we had one company. And I just took great pleasure in like dropping it into ministerial and senior conversations to say, imagine if ransomware actors decided to focus on that organization. So just thinking about where they might target, what they might achieve, and how they could cripple really day-to-day basic services, it clearly takes us into national security arena.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting now that we've decided that ransomware is a national security concern is that some of the in my view, artificial line between a nation state actor and a criminal actor sort of is beginning to disappear when we're addressing the crime itself. Would you agree?
If I can jump on the back
Yeah.
of that one, I would totally agree with that. My main sort of message that I try to put out is that for the day-to-day, lives of, the UK citizens, worrying about covert espionage and, like these actors like creeping around on networks when you're not even going to notice it, it's not going to affect your bottom line. Businesses don't even realize it's happening. I have to try and persuade them to take it seriously, right? But actual criminal activity and ransomware in particular, this is the stuff that will impact on people's lives. It's hugely important.
I did just to jump in. I that's what I was trying to say before. That's exactly right. That we had the big all the big cyber events with Microsoft Exchange and with the Russian activity back in the beginning of last year. And ordinary people are like, that's interesting. It doesn't really affect me. But when you have to stand in line for gas, it really changes the equation. So I do think that makes a huge difference in terms of how we deal with this. And we are so dependent on these issues that again, we have to keep that kind of pressure up, though, because I think there is this, what's the phrase in the UK, like done and dusted, done and dusty, something like that, that we're not even there yet. But it is amazing to see that transformation that we've seen. I mean, and that, again, I just think that's been foundational to everything else we've witnessed.
The only thing I would add to that, I think Chris and Eleanor are both right. I mean, for us, it doesn't matter. The victims are what matters. And whether we work it as an APT or a ransomware case and which section within or how we're working it with another agency such as CISA, that doesn't matter to the victim. What matters is our treatment of them and making sure they get the response they need. So that's what's important.
Yeah, and just one thing that I'd add to that, this blending between nation state and criminal groups, that's been true for a long time. And sometimes nation states use criminal groups as proxy actors. Look, I had the pleasure, I guess, of dealing with Russia for a long time, both when I was at the Department of Justice, and I chaired something called the G8 when there was a G8 high-tech crime group, and then the G7 dealing with Russia activity. And even at the White House, we had a Russia-US dialogue that lasted until they invaded Ukraine the first time. And we always had issues getting any kind of cooperation with Russia, and sometimes because Russia either directed the activity or, I know an issue we'll talk about, just turned a blind eye to it, this safe haven problem that Lisa also mentioned. But sometimes there was a corruption involved too. And so, to think of these siloed pillars of nation state versus criminal is just not true anymore. And as you say, sometimes to the victims, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I want to also pick up on something else that Lisa said, and we'll get back to the safe haven issue. But one of the things that we discovered in the ransomware task force as we were developing our recommendations was that, or we didn't discover it, but we realized it, was that ransomware is really the malware that's deployed at the end of a long series of crimes, right? So you have all of these actors that are committing crimes, and they just move to the next profitable thing. But they might develop some other kind of botnet to establish persistence in a network. We had the banking Trojans in the past. And we had other crimes that are taking place in order to get to the deployed ransomware. And so, David, I'd love to hear from your perspective. Sort of, given that, what are some of the better strategies for disrupting ransomware? I mean, we talked about a little bit. We will talk a little bit about payment disruption. I think Lisa mentioned that. And the crypto task force, infrastructure disruption, arresting more people. What, in your view, I would love to hear.
Yeah, great question. And I think Ari said it well at the very beginning. If we don't care who gets the credit for it, then that's how we're going to be effective. It's a whole of government approach. So the best options are it's the best athlete. It's who we can come together and work together with to actually defeat the adversary. I think the teamwork aspect of this, it's a team sport. You'll hear us say that over and over again. We've all got to come to the table together. We're doing a better job of that. We've been bringing together the public-private partnerships. We've been bringing together agencies. CISA has done an outstanding job with the JCDC. In the NCI JTF, we have 30 plus agencies there that are working together. And in terms of strategies, it's what we collectively do between all those agencies and all those private-public partnerships that's going to enable us to defeat the cyber adversary here. I think, and the Deputy Attorney General mentioned this, but with Soda Nakibi and Revel, that's a great example. I mean, I keep a copy on my desk of the DOJ press release, and if you go and take a look at that from last November of the indictment and the seizure of the 6.1 million, that press release actually almost has a third of that is just dedicated to those who collaborated together in that case. And it's not just the international partners, it's not just the interagency, but there's private sector partners there that are named as well. And so I think the strategies, I mean, the IST report's like a textbook for ransomware. It really is. And I think that's what we've got to do is team up with the experts in the private sector. We don't always have that expertise because of how complex cyber is. And we need to make sure that we're pairing up with everybody and bringing all those tools to the table.
I feel like that was, and I keep turning this on and off. I should probably just keep it on. I feel like that was a key point that Andrew Scurry also pointed out, sort of how important transparency and partnership will be in your pursuit of ransomware from your perspective. I'd love to hear more.
Sure. So I think in the UK, basically, as Andrew pointed out, we've kind of got two objectives that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to increase reporting, and we're trying to decrease payments. And we see that as the way at the heart of trying to kind of combat the scourge of ransomware. But we're not doing particularly well on either of those, I would argue right now, and there's still an awful lot of work to be done. A really important part of this is the visibility. So getting notifications through, understanding the threat landscape, seeing where these things are playing out. This is something that's really important to the authorities. We need to be able to know that in order to know where the trends are developing, and how the threat is being pursued. And I would argue that, in fact, the way that the kind of ecosystems are now, it's actually becoming less likely that incidents will make it to the attention of the authorities. I just want to I've got a little story from earlier this week that I wanted to replay. I was talking to a CISO of a really large UK company that was recently hit by ransomware, and who's been working with the NCSE because we had a prior relationship with them. So we've been accompanying him through the management of this incident. And he explained to me how it all unfolded. So, I mean, historically, we received incident reports from small and medium-sized enterprises, and those have started to tail off. We're just not receiving the same reports anymore. I don't think they're coming to us. I think they're going to their insurers. That's the first port of call. They're not coming to you, the 999 service for cyber that NCSE provides. They're going to their insurers. And this CISO explained to me that when the incident broke, obviously he did ring NCSE because we were in his Rolodex, so great. But also he rang his insurers. And the insurers put in place the package that exists to handhold a victim through this kind of an incident, which consists in a legal firm coming on board to run the entire incident from start to finish. And the legal firm brought in a dedicated CIR company, and also ransom negotiators from the outset built into the package with a kind of presumption that there was a likelihood that it would end up there. And I think from that perspective, given that that's the routine thing that you get now when you get your insurance policy, this is what you're paying for. You're paying for this package. This is what you can expect to see. So I think what I'm seeing now in the UK is that increasingly smaller organizations, they have this sort of a package. They are not coming to the authorities, and legal firms are not directing towards us. There's no requirement to come to the authorities. They don't stand to benefit enormously from reporting into us when this package exists. So he explained to me that this is the way it all works out. And crucially, the negotiation company that was involved reassured him that they dealt with over 300 of these kinds of incidents. And in 98% of cases, when a ransom was paid, the attackers kept their word and didn't leak the data. So, it was really encouraging and slightly self-serving to, you can imagine this ecosystem that exists, that is flourishing, and that basically exists to smooth the way towards paying cyber criminals in Russia and nearby states, the money they are seeking to achieve. It's a self-perpetuating circle. So the worry for me is the more that this kind of process exists, the less likelihood there is they're going to come to the authorities in the first place, and the greater the likelihood that the ransoms will actually be paid. And this is where really we're looking at all of the policy interventions that we can and what we can do to really sort of drive some wedges into that landscape.
You raise a good point, Eleanor. And in our task force report, we did, in our working groups, we did talk a fair amount about the stakeholders involved in involvement of cyber insurance, and we had a separate insert. Thank you so much for those insurance stakeholders that were a part of the working group to really explain the complexity and of how this all works. Chris, I want to ask you the new everything is acronized and I never get it right, but the new Cyber Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. Did I get that right? That requires reporting for cyber event. Or if you pay a ransom, that Lisa had mentioned and that Andrew had mentioned, do you have a sense that we meaning the government will and cyber researchers and security professionals will receive more information as a result of that act, given what Eleanor just?
Yeah, I think so and hope so. It's literally for 20 years, we've been talking about a reporting bill. I mean, I'm not kidding. 20 years ago, I remember starting to work on this to try to get some bill through Congress that would report, and get companies, hopefully voluntarily, but put some teeth in it, to report these, and particularly critical infrastructure. I mean, critical infrastructure for a reason. We can't live without them. And the fact that they don't have to report these incidents when the government has a real interest and can do something about it is just crazy. And I hadn't really heard that before, Eleanor. That's not great news that that's the way it's going in that direction. I remember literally, back in 1999, Lisa Monaco and then Janet Reno came out to Silicon Valley to have a big meeting about reporting, and so it's not a new issue. We've been talking about this, so I'm heartened by this. It's not everything that I think everyone wanted. I'd like to see a broader category. I'd like to have more data from companies. I think we have to convince companies they're not going to be victimized by reporting, and they're not. I mean, this is FBI's work for a long time to get rid of those myths. The myth that you're going to cart away all their servers and treat them as a victim. That's not the point. The point is really to help us get after this program. So it will take a while to get into effect. It has to be implemented, all those things. But I do think that's going to be a game changer for us. And we, as Phil and Kemba and all the rest of us know, we argued about these issues for a while. Like, should we ban ransomware payments? And we said, look, we can't agree on that. There's a division of opinion. But at the very least, we should ask companies who were victims, especially if they report the ransomware, or they pay the ransomware, to report. It just makes law enforcement's job easier. It makes the policy job easier. It makes the international job easier. And we can get these guys. And it's been shown that we can get these guys instead of creating, unfortunately, an ecosystem that allows them to operate even more smoothly.
This brings me to another issue, which is operating with impunity, right? And having these safe haven countries, or it's safe havens, where these criminals can act. And I'm curious, David, particularly from you and as representing the law enforcement community here, how feasible is it for us to be able to? What did we miss in order to be able to really tackle the problem of safe havens from your perspective? And then I would love to hear from Eleanor as well.
So I think it goes back to what you had asked earlier about strategies. I mean, I think when we're trying to find an adversary that is in a safe haven, it's looking at those wide range of the sanctions. Actually, I was over in the UK last week working with the NCSC at Cyber UK. And Eleanor's boss actually made a comment that he said, our job is to make their life so miserable, these bad actors, that they just hate their job every day, and that they don't want to do these acts anymore. And so I think to do that, we've got to look at a variety of options that each of the agencies can provide. So whether that's indictments, there's mixed opinions on indictments sometimes, whether or not that actually works. But I think sometimes that we've seen evidence that it does work, that it actually does have an impact on these bad actors and in their lives. Or whether we just and then once you indict them, you can wait. And sometimes they often do travel, and we're able, as we have over the last year, been able to capture some of them as they've traveled to other countries that do have extradition treaties. So I think there are options. There's a variety of options when you bring in the Cyber National Mission Force, you bring in the NSA, you bring in CISA. When we're all working together on this, there are a variety of options that we can impact them even in those safe havens.
I think my response to this question really would just go back to my earlier reflections. Like, basically, how can it be okay for us to have routine business practices in place that involve paying cyber criminals in Russia and the neighboring states? Like, this is a thing that exists, and it's okay. And our legal systems allow for it and permit it, and we have no recourse, as Dave is explaining, that is easy. Just to go back to my story very briefly, I'm going to dine out on this one for some time, but like, one of the benefits that was described to me of the legal firm that got involved in this particular case was the fact that they were able to explain to the bank why such a large transaction of hundreds of thousands of pounds was being released or being withdrawn and transferred into cryptocurrencies and then sent to Russia, and how that was okay. and how the legal firm was able to like smooth that over to explain that, oh no, it's not money laundering, it's just paying cyber criminals in Russia because that's actually legal. You know, like imagine that conversation. How can this be a normal routine part of business practice? I feel like that's the thing we should be cracking.
And I'm a recovering lawyer, but I would not do that. I would advise. I think part of this is, and you've seen some good activity. There are countries who are knowing safe havens. Russia obviously is one of them. And I think the US and others did the right thing, putting all kinds of pressure on Russia. Now, unfortunately, the tool set is limited. The same tool set we use for cyber is the tool set we've been using for Ukraine, just amped up. The same kind of activities we called for to put pressure on Russia for cyber, like SWIFT and all these other things, is being used in Ukraine. And any, I think, cooperation we're going to get from Russia, whether that was real cooperation or not, is a matter of true debate. And the rest they did. Obviously, that's not going to happen in the short term. So we also have to think about other tools we have. Sanctions, dealing with it, even using the disruptive tools of Cyber Command and similar places around the world. And that's a very slippery slope, but I think it's an interesting tool. If you can't get them and they keep acting with impunity, how do you actually get rid of them, or at least disrupt their activities? But there's another class of countries where they would help if they could, but they don't have the capability. They don't have the capacity. They haven't prioritized this issue. And there's a very positive agenda in terms of capacity building. Lisa Monaco mentioned it. There's a lot the UK is doing. My organization, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, is what we're all about. So building the capacity of these countries. And look, there's an analog for this. The FBI did a lot of this work in Eastern Europe back during like credit card fraud and other issues, and work with private industry, PayPal and others to do that. We can work with private industry to help these countries help us and help themselves. And I think that's an important element going forward, which we've seen some activity. The safe haven issue, and we didn't think it would be, really hasn't been solved in the years since we talked about these issues. It's been a long-standing issue, but I do think there's some avenues for progress.
Just a really tiny addition to that, just on behalf of my NCA colleagues, same as the FBI here. I know that just reflecting on Kemba's point about the complexity of all the different criminal actors and activities involved in ultimately delivering the ransomware at the end of the day, injecting at the right points in that process, identifying the weak spots, taking out the marketplaces, identifying the access brokers, managing to just sort of interfere and disrupt somewhere in that chain, that feels like an important step to try and take as well.
Yeah, yes, I want to unpack. There's so much that we've just talked about here, so much to unpack. Just to respond to Eleanor, one of the fantastic things that we discovered in the ransomware task force was just the variety of stakeholders that we need to work with. You mentioned cyber insurance, banks, finding the weak point, cryptocurrency exchanges, understanding the blockchain, and the weakest point in that blockchain, from my perspective, is when a victim has to convert fiat into crypto, or when a cyber criminal is seeking to convert crypto into fiat, and the crypto exchanges and the crypto economy and the traditional central banking system aren't necessarily friendly. They're getting better, but it's just interesting to me. There's something for everyone to do here. I want to unpack a little bit about what you said, Chris, and I would love to. We're going to scratch the surface here. We didn't really address in the task force report, as brilliant as it was, what was the role of the military? U.S. military cyber command, but the military in general. Is there a role? Is there something that we missed?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, you have to be careful about this because it's a slippery slope. But if this is really a national security issue, if these actors are acting with impunity, then you have to think, well, how can we disrupt these operations? Obviously, there's been great law enforcement work to disrupt the operations, to interrupt their money flow and other parts of which our DoD colleagues like to call the kill chain, which you're describing. But I don't know if we don't use those terms, but try to get after it at different parts. But you also have to think of innovative ways where can you target these organizations without causing peripheral or larger damage that will make their lives more difficult? And if you can use military tools, not missiles, but I mean cyber tools to do that, great. If you do it, I think with oversight, make sure it's done well. You work with countries to do that, but especially if you're doing it in a country where they can't do anything, I think there's some value to that. And frankly, we weren't the first ones. I mean, I think Australia talked about doing this 5 years ago in one of their strategies. They talked about using all the tools, including their intelligence and military tools, to disrupt criminal organizations. So it has to be a careful analysis. We have to be careful to do it. We don't want to create a slope where these are the tools you use for everything. So really on the high priority targets where you can't reach it. But I think there is a role.
You've all been sitting here watching us have our own personal conversation. I do have one more point that I want to sort of scratch a little bit, but we'll open up for questions in a moment so that you're part of our conversation. One of the things that I've seen recently that I didn't contemplate, and maybe some of you did, is the idea of using ransomware in an activism sort of way. We saw what happened in Costa Rica, and I think there were some reports. I'm looking at my colleague in the back from Microsoft, in Mexico and in Peru. There might be others. I've been operating under this idea that they're in it for the profit, and they are. So we have to reduce profits. But how do we address this ransomware as activism issue? Did you see it coming? Do you have any thoughts about it? And as you're forming questions, I'd love to hear.
I think just quick reflections from me on the fact that cyber activity for me has always had a geopolitical bent to it, right? And it's always been like, whenever we look at, obviously the APT and hostile state sort of activity, but also now the criminality, and of course the tools and the techniques are interchangeable and can be used for similar or different purposes. So I'm kind of not surprised. I see this as a natural extension of the sort of arms race or the kind of battlefield that we see where cyber is used and played out. And it needs to be sort of assessed in the same kind of way, I think, treated in the same sort of lens, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Eleanor hit it right on the head. I think that we have to be very careful with it. I think it was General Nakasone who recently was talking about some of the hacktivism and said, the danger there is the spillover potential. And so while they may have their own intentions, and it may have been something that not a lot of people paid attention to before, that spillover could have an effect on the civilian population and outside of their own intended targets. So it's a real issue. It's something that I think was a little bit looked at to the side before, as opposed to the ransomware and the APT actors. But now I think we've got to take a closer look at that and make sure that it's not affecting the vulnerable victims just from the spillover.
Yeah, and we've seen this before, hacktivists and others doing denial of service attacks and other things. So it's not really shocking. It's a little surprising though, because what we kind of assumed about ransomware actors is they were in it for the money. They wouldn't do it if there wasn't so much easy money involved. But it's not shocking this has happened.
Well, thank you for indulging me and having a conversation with my colleagues here. I would walk around and pass around the mic, but for the sake of COVID, well, I'm completely fine. And if you're comfortable using my mic, feel free to use it. If you want to use your outside voice and yell a question, you can do that too. But I'm going to hand my mic over in case anyone has.
Hi, Wendy Nather, Cisco. I was really fascinated by David's comment about how, despite a completely ambiguous entry, by an adversary, it takes a while for the FBI to figure out, okay, what crime is intended or has been committed, in which case, which department should we send it to? And, we've just been discussing this again. And also the fact that these actors can pivot on a moment's notice, and where they were trying to make money before, they can say, well, now I'm really ticked off. I'm just going to lay waste to the place and get out of here. Or I'm going to turn to extortion, or I'm going to, turn to some kind of lateral disruption to make a point. It can be anything. So my question is, should we be doing more busting of silos, or as I like to call them, cylinders of excellence, in how we treat cybercrime as opposed to any other kind of crime?
Yeah, Wendy, a really good question. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's sort of the point that we're trying to get to with the public-private partnerships, with the whole of government approach. I think that in a task force environment, which, we have multiple ransomware task forces, and if we are all working together in those and we bring them all together, you've got all the agencies there working on the same thing. As something comes in, I mean, the part of it is just the speed of getting that initial reporting. It's one, getting them to report. And then two, getting that in very quickly so that we can work with all the other agencies to determine the best route to the victim, who should make that approach, what we can do proactively in response and investigatively. So I think your comparison to the what you call them, the silos of excellence, or the cylinders of excellence, is really well put. We've got to break down those cylinders and make sure that that the intake all comes in, that we all see it at the same time, so that it doesn't go into different silos where different people are working on a duplicating effort.
And I don't think that the fact that we're concentrating on ransomware means that we're ignoring everything else, right? I think the ransomware has become the, never let a good crisis go to waste. Ransomware is sort of the boat. If you rise the water level, you rise all boats, and that's exactly what I think has happened here. And, being an older guy now, I can say it's not just like get off my lawn, get off my ransomware lawn, but don't go onto someone else's lawn. So we have to get this, look at this holistically too. So I do think breaking down those silos is important. But this is a good vehicle to get that attention, I think.
Just a tiny word from the UK perspective, where we also have our cylinders of excellence, but from the NCSC perspective, we are the civilian technical response and remediation agency, so like the sort of CISO equivalent, I guess. But we work super closely with our policing counterparts, who obviously are more on the criminal investigation side, but also crucially provide a really important sort of mitigation victim support element too. So there's this kind of grey area where we all coexist. So for us, it's absolutely essential that we have to be, on the same team, seeing the same reports, working out who does what, and kind of coordinating as we go along.
So I'm Michael Garcia. I'm and so I'm curious. Hey, I'm glad that in the panel that has Deterrence's name, I don't think Deterrence, so I lost my bingo card. But I'm curious though that we list all these great things that have happened the past year. Yet this morning, I believe Bill mentioned in Washington Post too about rise in ransomware payments. I think it was 70%. And so, have we actually deterred actors? David, you're mentioning about the debate, about indictments. I don't want to get to that, but I'm curious, a year from now, what are the actual kind of outcomes you want to achieve? Is it driving down the payments? Is it driving down the nexus between sub-criminal groups and inflation actors? I'm just curious, what is success going to look like? Because I feel like, now being a government, we don't articulate the outcome well, because then it allows us to achieve success. We say, this. But then at the end of the day, there's still transfer tax happening. There's still victims that pay certain amounts, and now you have a country that has to declare state of emergency because it's been crippled by criminal. So, anyone in the group panel, what would outcome and achievement look like?
I'll start. In the task force, we asked ourselves this question, and we realized that the problem was likely going to get worse before it got better. But we had to start somewhere, right? We had to recognize the problem and come up with some actionable solutions. We're in the nascent stages now, after a year of having those solutions appear before us, right? With new legislation, with all of our various task force, even just the fact that we're working together in this space. But I'm going to punt it to Chris and Eleanor.
Yeah. I mean, you're exactly right. A lot of this last year is building the foundation, right? And yes, we've done some really good operations, and that's great. But that also builds the muscle memory to do new ones, right? The Treasury has done good things in trying to sanction cryptocurrency actors. The Rewards for Justice Act was mentioned from one of my old homes. The State Department is really helpful, I think. All of these things are building blocks. We have to continue to implement and execute on these building blocks. So we didn't have all these structures there before. We have them there now. And I'd say that, for me, success is a substantial diminution. I also think we're hearing more about this, despite your story about people not reporting, because it's so much in the news. So I think we're hearing more than, a lot of this might have been happening before. We're hearing more about it. So I think what we need to do is substantially drive down both the number, severity, and amount of these, especially ones that we consider against critical infrastructure. I think that is a clear metric we continue to measure. And if we don't, that is a clarion call that we can't take the foot off the gas.
Yep, totally agree. And just to come in on the back of that, if you look at how things have evolved over the past year, particularly with the really high profile critical attacks, that attracted huge publicity, public outrage. My former CEO, Kira Martin, described last year as potentially strategic missteps on the part of some of these actors and potentially peak ransomware. And I think if you look at kind of the way it's evolved since then, certainly from the UK perspective, these really kind of big game targets are no longer in the sights of the actors. They've gone for the next tier down. They're still prolific. They're still making enormous amounts of money off it, but they're just not in the news every day to the same extent. It's not such a high profile set of targeting. And I think that's the evolution that we're trying to get a grip on. We need to ensure that despite the fact that they have taken it down a notch, they are actually coming to the attention of the authorities and being reported. So I think in a year's time, how things evolve going forward, I think really gripping that new phenomenon and managing to unpick that and intervene in that, that's where I'd like us to see to get to.
I also just say on the international front, we talked about the ransomware initiative, the 30-country meeting that happened. That's great. They had a lot of tasks assigned. They broke into working groups. That's ongoing too. So we'll track where that's going, and I think that's going to make progress internationally over time. But it's going to take time to get there. And interestingly, about that group, it wasn't just the usual suspects. It was countries that we often, the US and the UK, don't often have in these gatherings. It's not a G7 group. It was countries including Brazil and South Africa and India, which is important.
Gavin Wild from Carnegie. I have a question for David to put him on the spot. NSPM 13's been gotten a lot of coverage, obviously, but I want to get a sense about Rule 41, and if perhaps there's, obviously in the last few weeks it's become a bigger issue, and I wanted to know if, in your sense, it signals that maybe Rule 41 could play a more expansive role in countering ransomware than perhaps it has in the past.
I'll tell you, I'm not really prepared to answer that today. Yeah. But I can get back to you on that one. Yeah.
I do think it's interesting. The changes, which were a few years ago on Rule 41, that allowed some of the activity that's been done to actually force action, I think has been really interesting. And I think there is going to be a history going forward for that, or a chance to use that more. So I've been a fan of the way it's been, mostly the way it's been used so far to actually disrupt this activity.
I saw a few more hands. Okay, let me know if you want to use your outside voice or the mic.
No mic is fine. Hunter Ferguson from Microsoft. My question is triggered by something that Eleanor commented on, which is a concern about maybe downward trend in reporting from smaller and medium-sized businesses that might not have managed reporting opportunities. What do you think agencies can do to better educate those types of businesses, in particular, about the benefits to them individually and then communally about reporting? And then a follow-up on that, what do you think can be done to better share information back to victims that report? So when we talk about information sharing, typically we talk about a two-way street. In my experience in private practice is that a lot of victims, when their heads and hearts in the right place, report, but then feel like their reporting just went into the same. Never heard anything back.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that is spot on. I think the internal conversation in government in the UK can be a little bit fixated on well, we just need to know. We need to know what's happening, right, in order to inform our understanding and to just have the full threat picture. But we're not always terribly confident what our actual offer is. What are we supplying in these cases? Particularly once you start merging in law enforcement powers and civilian, are we seeking to support and assist on the remediation, which is what NCSC, stands ready to do, or are we going to do the criminal investigation side of it? We still need to be a bit clearer on what exactly the offer is. And then on the NCSC side, it's problematic because we can't offer that kind of remediation service, on a national level to all victims. So we have to kind of pick and choose what we want. So there's something about reporting as an essential component of understanding the threat landscape. We do need to know, right? That's really important data to inform our understanding. But then also having something to give back in return. And I think some of the reasons for the drop off in reporting are probably because of the lack of response, as you've described. So I know if you put in a request to action fraud in the UK saying, oh, I've had a cyber attack, they take about 3 weeks to get back to you. So, it's not really it's no surprise if people don't traditionally kind of follow up on that. And then I think you're absolutely right. Once we have worked out what that offer looks like and being really clear and, promoting it sufficiently, the feedback loop and being able to explain what difference it's made and being able to justify having had that pipeline open, that's absolutely critical as well. And I think kind of publishing the threat information and publishing what we're able to pick out, that's a huge part of it too, which obviously your organization does plenty of as well.
If I could add to that, it's a great question. It's something we're working on now. So with our colleagues at CISA, we actually have a weekly call, and it's an issue that we recognize that we're not providing enough feedback back to the public or back to the victims. And so it's something that we're doing now, especially for the higher profile incidents and those that we think affect a number of victims, where we're taking in all of the best practices that we're seeing and on those specific incidents, and then making sure that we're tracking which victims we've reached back out to. It's difficult because of the volume, but it's something that all the agencies have realized that it needs to be a two-way street in order for us to get more reporting. And so it's literally something that we're working on as we speak, and it's already in the process.
And all these issues are not new. I mentioned having this thing like 20 years ago now in Silicon Valley about this. And Michael Daniel will recall when we were in the government, you could take away all the barriers to reporting, liability concerns, antitrust concerns, information sharing concerns, all of those. But unless there's a business reason to report, you're not going to get what you want. And especially not to impugn lawyers. And we're at a law firm, and I'm a recovering lawyer. But normally people are risk averse. They say, well, why, if I report, I may expose myself to something. So why should I need to do it? So we do have to make, I think, the case for this is going to help you, and here's why, and publicize when we've had these successes. And a good example to me is the recovery of the Colonial Pipelines ransomware. I mean, I think that's one great example.
I think we have time for one more question. I think we're between you and lunch. I think over here there was a question and there was one in the back. If they're quick, we can get both. Here.
We talked a little bit about, I think around this a little bit, the topic. So we're talking about stakeholders on the defender side, insurance companies, the law enforcement, whatever it may be. We haven't really talked about the stakeholders on the criminal side. Ransomware, I think just focusing on ransomware in and of itself is a little bit misguided. I understand that it's important because it kind of brings the whole attention to cybercrime, but ransomware doesn't exist in and of itself. It exists in an ecosystem. If we think about some of these successful takedowns, there have been very few successful takedowns of the ransomware operators themselves. Usually it's hosting, usually it's the money laundering, usually it's the botnets, whatever it may be. So I think what we really need to focus on is really understanding the ancillary services, a lot of which don't only exist in the countries that are the safe havens. A lot of them exist outside the countries that are safe havens. So I think to be effective in this, we really have to look at ransomware again as part of the whole ecosystem of cybercrime, because again, the ransomware operators a lot of times don't do the hacking. Obviously, there's the initial access brokers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's just, I guess, not a question, but just a suggestion or an opinion.
Okay, we're going to do something a little bit new. So we're going to table your question. We have one more question, and then we'll answer them both at the same time. In the back, if you want to use your outside voice, or
you mentioned that data process was 98% of victims who paid ransom were able to recover their data. Obviously, there is a business reason to want to recover data. Do you feel like mandating people not to pay, do you feel like that's at odds with the other problem you mentioned of not having a lot of declining reporting? Because it seems like you'd be forcing businesses to choose between not paying and telling the
telling the government or paying and not telling the government.
You're exactly right. It's the worst of both possible worlds. So, so it's a completely rational business decision to make to pay that ransom, where you're like, yeah, in 98% of cases, paying it did assure the safety of the data, right? So it's actually, from the data commissioner point of view, you're taking a reasonable step to actually protect the data. It absolutely makes sense. But what we in the UK have done is we've made really clear that we don't approve of the payment of ransoms. So businesses are in that weird situation where like it makes absolute sense to pay. They just shouldn't tell us about it, right? Because like we've created that environment. So this is definitely what we need to work on. Yeah.
Look, I think this is why we debated this issue in the ransomware task force. Should you ban payments? And we decided, look, whether you do or not, you need a glide path to get there. It should take, there's a number of things we have to do before we can get to the point we do that, because it does create this incentive, and actually ends up victimizing the victims again, because they're left into this conduit. And why I think it's important to report when ransomware is paid. First, I also challenge the 98% bit. I think that's way, way high.
Could have said any number, right?
I think it's just a wild ass guess. Basically, I just don't think it's reliable. And I think that even if you get your data back, it takes you a long time to get your systems back in order. And then there's the secondary part of threatening to release your data to extort you. So we see that too. And then this is true before ransomware. If you pay off the people who are doing it, then you're an attractive target to come back. Here, someone's going to pay. So not just on ransomware, but to your point, other groups will come after you as a target because you're seen as an easy mark, which is a problem. And on your point, I think that, look, I do think, rising tide lifts all boats, great. Ransomware, a great vehicle, but you have to look at all parts of this criminal enterprise and wherever that's located. And I know my colleagues here are doing that. I mean, they're going after, again, the whole chain of looking at how they're enabled, how they're used, how they communicate with other groups. I'm a big fan in countries where you can do it, of doing undercover operations to get in these groups. I think there's a lot you could do to bust them out.
I don't know if David wants to get in on this, but I'll just throw a little nugget out there. I would love to see justice, and I don't know if Ms. Monaco is still listening, but I would love to see justice bring a criminal RICO case precisely for that reason. This is a criminal enterprise. Or the private sector to bring a civil RICO case. I think that would be responsive. But listen, I really appreciate you indulging us in our conversation, watching us talk. Glad that you were able to participate. We're here. I think we're going to have a couple of announcements, and then it's time for your box lunch. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yes, and thank you to Kimba for moderating the panel. We will have a couple of more panels in the afternoon. Right now, though, we will release you to go grab your lunch. I will say, please grab it and come back, because we will be getting right back in. There will be a reception afterward, lots of time for networking then. That's not what this is for. Really, actually, we're going to get right back to it at 12:15 with Director Easterly. So please do grab your food, come on back, and we'll get started at 12:15.